Voidmage Gamer is now partnered with Flipside Gaming, so you can use the promo code on their website, all caps, Voidmage, to get 10% off all orders $10 or more. It's a great way that you can support both Flipside Gaming and Voidmage Gamer's channel. Hello guys, welcome back to another Oathbreaker deck tech. Previous one I did was Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord. I said in that video how I really like the Oathbreaker format, think it's a cool alternative to Commander. When I do play Magic the Gathering, I'm almost all about Commander. Very little of anything else interests me. The only exception maybe being limited. So having an actual constructed format where you kind of take the essence of Commander, the singleton, eternal format essence, and apply it to like 60 card formats. A little bit more competitive, I would say. You're at 20 life, so aggression is rewarded, and I think it's different enough from Commander so I can keep coming back to it, thinking of how different spells interact with different planeswalkers. And this time around for my Oathbreaker and signature spell, I chose Davriel Rogue Shadowmage and Dark Deal. Davriel Rogue Shadowmage is just a 3-mana planeswalker, uncommon for more of the spark. He's not super complicated, doesn't really do anything else other than this passive. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, Davriel is going to deal 2 damage to them. And he has a -1 if target player discards a card at only 3 loyalty. Don't expect him to stay out there long, because the way we're going to play this deck, it's not going to take long for our opponents to have an empty hand. Dark Deal at first glance just looks like another Wheel of Fortune kind of card. However, instead of drawing 7 or the same number of cards you discarded, you draw that many -1. So if you only have 1 card left in your hand, you're not going to draw anything more. 2, you're only going to draw 1. 3, you're only going to draw 2. So it works out perfectly in this deck, because even if you're not at the point where you're just going to dump a whole bunch of racks out there, it's at least going to be card draw for you. And I don't think it's a super threatening spell, but the way we have this deck built, it's going to be pretty deadly when we do cast it. And as always, remember, in order to cast your signature spell, you must first have your Oathbreaker out there, which does help because Davriel's not an expensive planeswalker. He's only 3. Turn 6, you can easily just play both. If you didn't already notice, Davriel's passive is awfully similar to another card called the Rack. We're going to have a lot of cards that are exactly like this, or do something similar to this, where you just have a bunch of them out there, you cast your Dark Deal, anything else that forces your opponent to empty their hands, and then the racks are just going to pile up on your opponents. In a format with only 20 life, a strategy like this is incredibly effective compared to Commander, where you probably aren't going to see the rack. You're more likely to see what's the opposite of the rack strategy, and that's Nekasar, but that's more about just keeping a full hand and punishing your opponents for having a lot of cards in their hand. Now, the modern deck 8 rack has other cards you're going to see in here, something like Shrieking Affliction, just a 1-mana enchantment, super efficient cards, but pretty much does the same thing. If that player has 1 or fewer cards in their hand at the beginning of their upkeep, they're going to lose 3 life. If we're going to continue with that trend, we have a variety of different spells that are going to do something similar. If you like Davriel, Paupers Cage is similar to that. A little bit better though, because they just have to have 2 or fewer cards in their hand, deals 2 damage to them. Wheel of Torture is kind of similar to the Rack. A little bit more mana though. Never really hurts to have more of these in the deck. We have Nezumi Shortfang, which is a really cool rat that can transform itself. And when it becomes Stab Whisker, it's kind of like another Rack effect. And we also have the Rackling, which is basically the creature version of the Rack. In a 60 card deck, we do have that consistency where we have a lot of those at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep triggers, so that Davriel isn't just carrying the whole weight of the deck. We're not just going to be relying on that Rack trigger, because we also want to impact the game just by forcing our opponents to discard. And some all-stars when it comes to doing that is Liliana's Caress, Megrim, Waste Not, and Geth's Grimoire. All of these are just fantastic. You get nothing but value off of them, especially Waste Not and Geth's Grimoire, where you can just keep drawing more cards, get more value off of that. This is probably the biggest reason why I decided to go with Dark Deal over something like Syphon Mind, because it's going to allow us to force our opponents to discard a lot of cards. Because it's Dark Deal and not a Wheel of Fortune, they're going to end up with even less card advantage than they had before. And we have a lot of good cards that are going to enable this discard strategy, forcing our opponents to discard at an alarming rate, such as Words of Waste, Creeping Dread, Painful Quandary, and the Eldest Eldest Reborn, especially if you can get a Painful Quandary out there. In a format with only 20 life, if your opponent has to choose between losing 5 life or discarding a card, they're definitely discarding a card. It could be quite painful to actually play Magic when you have these spells out there. Now, it never really hurts to, although I can understand why people who want to play this format on a budget might not want to play Liliana of the Veil. She's worth it though in this deck. The +1 forcing each player to discard a card, just keeping them down there is always important, and the -2 is still pretty good. Dominant Planeswalker just about everywhere you put her, especially if you can synergize with her, and she works out really well in this deck. Now, the bulk of the deck is kind of spell similar to Dark Deal, but a lot more oppressive for our opponents. On the small scale, we just want to force our opponents to discard. We don't want to have to discard ourselves if we can help it. Something like Vicious Rumors is efficient, and it kind of does a little bit of everything. It even mills them a bit. Arterial Flow, while we don't play any vampires in the deck, it's in here because it forces each opponent to discard 2 cards for just 3 mana. And it doesn't force us to discard, which is the good thing. Delirium Skeins is actually a really sweet card, forcing each player to discard 3 cards for just 3 mana. You discard, but at this point, you just want to have a ton of racks out there so that whenever it's your opponent's upkeep, they're going to lose a bunch of life. So even if you end up with 0 cards in your hand, it's worth it if you can ensure your opponents don't have any cards in hand. Tasigur's Cruelty, kind of the same deal. Efficient spell, especially if you can delve it out there, and an all-star in the deck because it empties all hands. Awaken the Erstwhile. Each player is going to discard all the cards in their hand, and then they create that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. Once you have your racks out there, it's pretty much game over. You have zombies, doesn't matter if they try to swing at you, who cares? Keep the pressure on your opponents. We also have some pretty sweet creatures that are going to help us force our opponents to discard. Burglar Rat is like my favorite 2-drop. Liliana Specter pretty much does the exact same thing. Plaguecrafter, it's a format with planeswalkers, so if you're not forcing them to sacrifice a planeswalker or a creature, they're going to discard a card. And Herald of Anguish is the big daddy in this deck that we're going to go with. At the beginning of our end step, each opponent's going to discard a card. The only reason why it's in here. If you want to go for win cons because all that discard's not enough and you don't have any faith in the rack, Mind Twist is a really cool way to empty one opponent's hand, while Torment of Hailfire is pretty much just a win con in itself. And if you're wondering where we're going to get all that mana from, well, there's a card called Cabal Coffers and one called Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. We also have Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. So if you're looking for extra bit of mana generation, you are playing mono black, and mono black has a tendency of getting a ton of mana. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for the deck tech. It's mono black at its ugliest, its nastiest. Not the most fun to play against because you're constantly emptying your opponent's hands, but just a strategy I had to go with because these War of the Spark planeswalkers make the best options for Oathbreakers because of their passives, and I think it's going to add another dimension to this game when your planeswalkers can do something more beyond their loyalty abilities. And when you have a commander-like figure that's basically the Rack, or something to that effect, why not build a deck in Oathbreaker that's pretty much like 8-Rack in Modern? Let me know what you guys think about Oathbreaker. I'll try to make more deck techs if people are really interested in the format. If not, I'm just going to keep doing the usual with Commander. You guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off. See you all next video.